Are corporations evil? It's a question we hear a lot, usually followed by a quick yes or no, but the real answer is a lot more complicated and a lot more chilling. Let's talk about a small town in Missouri called Times Beach. It was originally planned as a fancy riverside getaway for the rich, but that dream fizzled out. Instead, it became a quiet rural town, a place where working class families lived. But Times Beach had a problem. It was so poor. They couldn't afford to pave their roads. And in the summer, that meant dust, unbearable, choking clouds of dust that covered everything. To solve this, the town hired a local businessman named Russell Bliss. He ran a waste oil service and he had an idea. He'd spray an oily substance on the dirt roads. The oil would make the dirt stick together, keeping the dust down. It worked like a charm. The town found a cheap solution to their dust problem, and Mr. Bliss found a new way to make some extra cash. It was a win-win, or so it seemed. Now let's zoom out a bit. Not far from Times Beach, a corporation called Hoffman Taff was running a chemical plant. They were manufacturing the components for Agent Orange, the infamous defoliant used in the Vietnam War. A nasty byproduct of this process, a chemical sludge, was stored in a massive tank on their property. Eventually, Hoffman Taff went out of business and their plant was bought by another company, Nipaco. Nipaco had a problem of their own, that giant tank full of chemical waste. They needed to get rid of it. So they put the job out for bids and contracted a company called the Independent Petrochemical Corporation, or IPC. Why them? Simple. IPC's bid was incredibly low, way cheaper than anyone else. They offered to haul away the waste for just $3,000 a load. You might be wondering, how could IPC do it so cheaply? Well, they weren't actually doing the work themselves. They subcontracted the job to a local company, paying them just $125 per load. And who was that local company? You guessed it. Russell Bliss and his waste oil service. Now think about the chain of responsibility here. Did Nipaco, the company that owned the toxic waste, ever check up on what IPC was doing with it? Nope. Did IPC, the company hired to dispose of it, make any effort to ensure their subcontractor, Mr. Bliss, was handling these dangerous chemicals properly? Not at all. Russell Bliss, meanwhile, suddenly had a whole lot of waste oil on his hands. He was getting paid to haul it away, and then he could turn around and get paid again to spray it on roads to keep the dust down. It was the perfect side hustle. He was mixing this chemical sludge with his regular use motor oil and spraying it all over Times Beach and other places in the area, like horse stables and arenas. Here's the problem nobody seemed to care about. The chemical byproduct wasn't just oil. It was dioxin. And dioxin is not something you want anywhere near you. It is one of the most toxic chemical compounds ever created by humans. It's deadly to pretty much all forms of life. Did anyone tell Russell Bliss he was handling one of the most poisonous substances on Earth? Did IPC or Nipaco ever mention, hey, be careful with this stuff, it's incredibly dangerous? No, they just wanted it gone, cheap and easy. It didn't take long for things to go horribly wrong. In the towns and stables where Bliss had sprayed, birds started falling out of the sky. Dead. At one of the horse arenas he sprayed, dozens of horses got sick and died. People started getting sick too. They complained of mysterious nosebleeds, constant headaches, diarrhea, and terrible stomach pains. Children who played in the dirt developed painful skin rashes and sores that wouldn't heal. Pets were dying. The strange illnesses and animal deaths were so alarming that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, eventually got involved. They started an investigation, but at the time, they knew very little about the long-term effects of dioxin. Their initial assessment was tragically wrong. They believed dioxin had a short half-life, meaning it would break down and become harmless relatively quickly. So, they recommended little action. But the sicknesses didn't stop. People in Times Beach kept getting worse. Years went by. Finally, the CDC went back and re-evaluated their data. They made a horrifying discovery. Dioxin doesn't have a short half-life. It has an extremely long one. It was staying in the soil, potent and deadly for years. With this new information, the EPA and CDC finally swung into action, but it was far too late. They tested the soil in Times Beach and found dioxin levels up to 2,000 parts per billion. To give you some context, the level considered safe for residential soil today is 1 part per billion. The ground itself was lethal. The federal government had no choice. In 1983, they announced a mandatory evacuation. The entire town of Times Beach was bought out. Every home, every business. The 2,000 residents were forced to leave everything behind. The town was wiped off the map. A massive, years-long, incredibly expensive cleanup began. They had to literally incinerate tons upon tons of contaminated soil. Today, the area is technically habitable again. The dioxin is gone, but Times Beach is still empty. It's now a state park, a ghost town, haunted by the memory of what happened. So let's go back to our original question. Was this evil? Was there a villain twirling his mustache, cackling as he poisoned the town? No, not really. Hoffman-Taff was just fulfilling a government contract. Nepacco just wanted to empty a tank left by the previous owner. IPC was a middleman, just trying to turn a quick profit. And Russell Bliss? He was just a small-time businessman, trying to make some extra money. Nobody woke up in the morning wanting to hurt anyone. And yet, an entire town was destroyed, and countless lives were ruined. Why? Because at every step of the way, people cut corners. They chose the cheapest option without asking if it was the safest. Nepacco and IPC chose not to look, not to ask questions, not to take responsibility. It wasn't evil in the classic sense. It was logical from a purely business perspective. And that is the terrifying truth about corporate self-governance. A corporation's primary motivation is profit. It's not about actively trying to cause harm, because bad publicity and lawsuits are bad for business. But it does mean that when given a choice between prioritizing safety and maximizing profit, profit will almost always win. The story of Times Beach isn't a story about evil. It's a story about indifference. And sometimes, indifference is even more dangerous. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. See you next time.